"Don't mention the will," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. An hour later, my stepfather slammed my door open. I hit the floor, blood dripping onto a time-stamped memo 10:42 p.m. I kept it, not for pity, but as proof of the day he chose fists over words. 3 years later, that single piece of paper was enough to bring his entire corporation to its knees. All I had to do was press forward. My name is Rachel Moore. At 32, my life was a carefully curated structure of rules, clauses, and controls. As the compliance manager for Hendricks Group, a construction empire with a $900 million annual revenue, my job was to be the architect of its ethical framework, the guardian against the very chaos my stepfather, CEO Mark Hendricks, seemed to court. I lived by the book because it was the only thing that made sense in a world governed by a man who wrote his own rules. My apartment in downtown Chicago was an extension of that philosophy, minimalist, orderly, a quiet sanctuary of gray and white 20 floors above the city's ceaseless roar. The call came at 9:38 p.m. The sharp, digital ring of my phone sliced through the quiet hum of the dishwasher. It was my mother. She never called this late, unless it was an emergency, a fact that sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my veins. "Mom, is everything okay?" I asked, my voice already tight with a professional's habit of anticipating the worst-case scenario. Her voice came through the line as a ragged whisper, thin and frayed, as if it had to fight its way past her own teeth. "Rachel, listen to me. Don't mention the will. Do you hear me?" "Don't even think about it." I frowned, the cold spike turning into a dull throb of confusion. The will. Grandma Helen's will. Why would I mention it? It's been settled for years. "He knows you were looking at the digital archives," she hissed, and in the background, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a television, a sports game, maybe. The sound of normalcy clashing with the panic in her voice. "He's been drinking. He's saying things. Rachel, he's losing control." I sat down on the edge of my sofa, the leather cool against my skin. "Mom, what things? What is he talking about?" "I was reviewing trust filings as part of the quarterly audit. That's all. The will is irrelevant. It's held in a trust, administered by the bank's lawyers. No one can touch it. Mark knows that." I was speaking in the calm, measured tones I used with frantic department heads, trying to impose logic on an emotional situation. "Logic doesn't matter to him right now," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just be careful. Don't talk to him. If he calls, don't answer. Promise me." A familiar weariness settled over me. This was the dance we always did. She would warn me of his temper, of his moods, pleading with me to be the one to bend, to accommodate, to disappear. She lived in the shadow of his volatile temper, and her solution was always to make the target smaller. Never to confront the man casting the shadow. "I promise," I said, the words tasting like ash. "I'm not going to engage with him." The line went dead. I stared at the black screen of my phone. My mother's fear a tangible presence in my sterile apartment. It felt ridiculous. The will was ironclad. My grandmother, Helen Hendricks, had been a formidable woman who trusted her husband's successor about as far as she could throw one of his bulldozers. She had structured her will to protect my mother, leaving her a 35% stake in the company, a controlling interest that was supposed to be her shield. It was untouchable, a legal fortress. Mark's paranoia was his own problem. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the river of headlights flowing along Wacker Drive. The city was a grid of light and order, predictable, controllable, just like my job, just like the law. I breathed out, the condensation clouding the glass. My mother was overreacting. He was drunk and spouting nonsense. It would pass. But for the next hour, a low hum of anxiety vibrated just beneath my skin. The quiet of my apartment felt different, not peaceful, but predatory. I tried to read, but the words on the page were just black marks. I tried to watch a show, but the canned laughter felt alien and mocking. The silence was a held breath, waiting for something to break. The grandfather clock in the corner of my living room, a relic from my real father's side of the family, ticked with an unnerving loudness, each second a slow, deliberate footstep approaching my door. And then, at 10:40 p.m., the footsteps became real. It wasn't a knock. It was a violent, percussive slam of a fist against my apartment door. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was an explosion in the stillness, shaking the prints on my walls. My heart leaped into my throat, cold and heavy. I knew, with absolute certainty, who it was. "Rachel, open this damn door. I know you're in there." Mark's voice was a gravelly roar, slurred by expensive whiskey, but sharpened by rage. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, my mother's warning screaming in my mind. "Don't talk to him." The banging came again, harder this time, rattling the door in its frame. "You think you can hide from me? In my building, I own this place. You little brat." My mind raced. Calling security would be useless. They knew who he was. They would see it as a family matter and defer to the CEO. My options were to wait him out and risk him breaking the door down, or to face him. I chose the latter, clinging to the naive belief that reason could still prevail. I took a deep breath, walked to the door, and unlocked it. He stood there, a storm in a $1,000 suit. His tie was loose, his face flushed, and his eyes, usually a cold, calculating blue, were bloodshot and wild. The smell of whiskey rolled off him in a wave, thick and cloying. He pushed past me into the apartment, his size seeming to shrink the room instantly. "What do you want?" "Mark," I asked, my voice colder and steadier than I felt. I closed the door behind him, a foolish attempt to contain the chaos. He spun around, his finger jabbing the air in front of my face. "What do I want? I want to know who the hell you think you are, poking around in company documents, going behind my back. I was doing my job," I stated, keeping my tone level. "It's called a compliance audit. You signed off on it yourself. I was reviewing financial controls related to the trust archives, which, as you know, fall under SOC 2 compliance." He let out a short, barking laugh that held no humor. SOC 2. "Don't you dare hide behind your corporate jargon with me. You weren't looking at controls. You were looking at the will. Your mother told me. Trying to find a loophole. Trying to get your hands on what's mine. What's yours?" The question slipped out, sharper than I intended. "Grandma Helen left her shares to Mom. Not to you. That was my mistake. The moment I said it," the air crackled. His face darkened, the drunken fury coalescing into something solid and terrifying. He took a step forward, backing me against the wall. "That's where you're wrong," he snarled, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Your mother and I are a unit. What's hers is mine. And you are an ungrateful child who I gave a job to, a home to. And this is how you repay me, by trying to turn my own wife against me, by trying to sabotage my company with your petty little reports." The memo I wrote was about missing access logs. "Mark, it's a standard security protocol. It has nothing to do with you personally. It's about protecting the company from liability. You are the liability," he roared, his voice bouncing off the minimalist walls of my carefully ordered life. "You and your sanctimonious rulebook. You think you're so smart, so untouchable, but you're nothing. You're just a name on a payroll I approve." He was too close now. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the pulsating vein in his temple. My training, my entire career, was about de-escalation, about using logic to diffuse conflict, but there was no logic here. There was only raw, wounded pride and alcohol-fueled paranoia. "You need to leave," I said, my voice a whisper. He smiled then, a cruel twist of his lips. "I'll leave when I'm done." He raised his hand. For a split second, I thought he was going to point his finger in my face again. The punch came out of nowhere, a blinding flash of force. It wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist, connecting with the side of my head with a sickening thud. The impact sent a starburst of white-hot pain through my skull and threw me off balance. I stumbled sideways, my legs giving out, and collapsed onto the floor. My head hit the corner of the low-slung coffee table with a sharp crack. The room tilted, the clean lines of my furniture blurring into a nauseating swirl. I could taste blood, warm and metallic, in my mouth. I lay there, dazed, the ticking of the grandfather clock impossibly loud. He stood over me, a towering silhouette against the city lights. He didn't look shocked or remorseful. He looked satisfied. "Let that be a lesson," he said, his voice calm now, chillingly so. "You're just like your mother. You think you're strong, but you break so easily." He bent down, his face close to mine. "And don't even think about telling anyone. A hysterical daughter making wild accusations against her loving stepfather. No one will ever believe you." He straightened his suit jacket, turned, and walked out, leaving the door wide open. I heard his heavy, confident footsteps recede down the hallway, followed by the ding of the elevator, and then silence, a profound, ringing silence, broken only by the clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock. I lay on the floor for a long time, the cold hardwood a strange comfort against my throbbing cheek. The pain was a physical anchor in a sea of shock and disbelief. He had crossed a line that I never, in my most fearful moments, believed he would cross. The implicit threat had become explicit violence, slowly, deliberately. I pushed myself up. My hand went to my head, and my fingers came away wet. A small cut from the table. Blood dripped from my lip onto the collar of my white silk blouse. Then I saw it. A single drop had fallen onto a piece of paper on the table, a printout of a memo draft I had been reviewing. My phone was on the sofa. My movements were stiff, robotic, as if my body belonged to someone else. I picked it up. My hands were shaking, but my mind was eerily calm, the shock giving way to a cold, clear focus. I didn't call the police. I didn't call my mother. I pressed the record button on the voice memo app. I wanted to capture the aftermath, the sound of my own ragged breathing, the oppressive silence of the violated room, the indifferent ticking of the clock, measuring out the seconds of my new reality, and in that recording, another sound emerged, a sharp, digital chime from my work laptop on the coffee table, the sound of an incoming email. I crawled over to the table. The screen was bright in the dim room. There, in my inbox, was a system-generated notification. Subject Board Audit Missing SOC2 Memo. From System Administrator to Board of Directors. R. Moore. M. Hendricks. Sent 10:42 p.m. The memo, the one I had written and scheduled. The one flagging the critical security gap in the digital archives, the very archives he was so paranoid about. It had been programmed to send automatically at the end of the business day if the issue wasn't resolved. He hadn't resolved it. He had come here instead. 10:42 p.m. The clock on the wall read 10:44 p.m. The grandfather clock began to chime the quarter hour. The recording on my phone captured it all, the chimes, my unsteady breathing, the digital timestamp of his fury. At that moment, I didn't understand the full legal ramifications. I didn't know that the convergence of a digital trail and a physical assault would create a weapon of such devastating power. I didn't know that the number 1042 would become the fulcrum upon which his entire empire would pivot and collapse. All I knew, as I sat on the floor of my perfect apartment with blood on my lip and a recording of his crime humming on my phone, was that everything had changed. The threat he'd spat at me. "No one will ever believe you" was a lie. He had just handed me the proof. From that night on, I was no longer the good daughter, the compliant employee playing by the rules. He had taught me a new game. I was no longer a victim, I was a witness, and my testimony was already being written. The Hendricks Group was not so much a company as it was a kingdom, built of steel, concrete, and the unshakable ego of the Hendricks men. Its headquarters was a 50-story monument to brutalist architecture in the Chicago Loop, a dark gray monolith that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. The lobby was a cavern of polished black marble and uncomfortable leather chairs, dominated by a massive oil-painted portrait of my stepfather's father. A man with the grim, joyless expression of someone who had built an empire and found it wanting. Mark's own portrait, hung slightly lower, was a modern imitation, capturing his signature look of aggressive charisma. From the outside, it was the picture of American success, a family enterprise nearing $1 billion in annual revenue. From the inside, it was a court, and Mark Hendricks was its volatile, absolute monarch. I had earned my place there, not inherited it. After getting my MBA from Northwestern and a certification in corporate compliance, I started at the very bottom, as a compliance assistant. I made a point of it. I wanted no one, least of all Mark, to ever be able to say he handed me anything. I processed paperwork in a cubicle for 2 years, learning the intricate guts of the company, the flow of money and material, the labyrinthine paths of contracts and subcontracts. I was Rachel Moore, a quiet, efficient employee, not Rachel Moore, the CEO's stepdaughter. The distinction was a shield. Mark, however, never saw the distinction. To him, I was a curiosity, an overeducated outsider playing a game of make-believe in his world of real men and real work. He would introduce me at corporate functions with a patronizing chuckle. "This is Rachel. She's our compliance guru. She makes sure we color inside the lines." The implication was clear: the lines were his to draw, and my job was a frivolous, decorative nuisance. He saw my degrees not as qualifications, but as affectations, my adherence to regulations as a sign of weakness, a lack of the killer instinct that had built this company. He fundamentally misunderstood me. He thought I was trying to join his world. I was trying to build a cage of rules around it. His control was total, an atmosphere of fear cultivated with surgical precision. He ruled the boardroom not with strategy but with intimidation. I once saw him systematically dismantle a senior vice president, a man with 30 years at the company, for a rounding error in a quarterly projection. He didn't just correct him, he humiliated him, his voice dropping to a soft, venomous purr as he dissected the man's incompetence in front of his peers. The board members, a collection of aging sycophants who owed their fortunes to him, would nod along, their expressions carefully neutral. They were lions in their own departments but neutered cats at his table. And he ruled my mother with a different kind of terror, the quiet, insidious kind that masquerades as affection. He had draped her life in diamonds and cashmere, isolating her in a beautiful prison of his own design. She became a ghost in her own home, her opinions fading to echoes of his. Whenever I would try to speak to her about his temper, his dismissiveness, his barely veiled contempt for me, she would retreat behind a wall of practiced denial. "He's under a lot of pressure. Rachel," she'd say, arranging flowers in a vase, her eyes focused anywhere but on me. When I took the job at Hendricks Group, I'd argued against it, but she was insistent. "It's a good opportunity," she'd said. It was years later, during one particularly bitter holiday dinner, that the truth finally came out in a desperate whisper in the kitchen. "He gave you a job. Rachel, it's what keeps the peace." My existence in his company was a concession, a sacrifice she made to appease the god in her household. I was a peace offering. It was my job to read the fine print, and in the fine print of Hendricks Group, I began to see the rot. It started small, an invoice for $50,000 worth of drywall from a subcontractor I'd never heard of, for a project that was already completed. I flagged it. A week later, the invoice disappeared from the system, but the payment had gone through. Then came a consulting fee to a holding company in Delaware with no public footprint. Then a series of equipment leases for machinery that never appeared on our asset ledgers. I started digging, working late, long after the sycophants and yes-men had gone home, in the server rooms, in the digital archives he was so paranoid about. I founded a parallel world. For every legitimate, board-approved project, there was a shadow version: ghost contracts, inflated material costs, phantom subcontractors. It was a sophisticated, self-contained system of fraud, siphoning millions of dollars out of the company and into a web of shell corporations. He wasn't just building skyscrapers. He was building a secret, secondary empire funded by the first, armed with meticulously organized data. I requested a meeting with him. I presented my findings calmly, laying out the discrepancies on his vast mahogany desk. my charts and spreadsheets a stark, logical indictment. I thought, naively, that he might be clever about it, that he might feign surprise and promise an internal investigation. He did neither. He leaned back in his leather throne of a chair and laughed. It was a deep, genuine laugh, full of amusement and contempt. "Rachel, Rachel, Rachel," he said, shaking his head as if I were a child who had just tried to explain calculus using finger paints. "You've been working too hard. Mark, these are serious irregularities. This is wire fraud. The SEC would—" He held up a hand, and I fell silent. "Do you have any idea how many memos cross my desk every day? How many reports, audits, and projections I'm supposed to read?" He gestured to the stacks of pristine, unread binders lining his shelves. "Nobody reads your compliance memos. Sweetheart, it's paperwork. It's the cost of doing business to keep the watchdogs in their kennels. You write your little reports, I sign them, and the world keeps turning. Now, stop worrying about things you don't understand and get back to your coloring." That was the moment the last shred of familial obligation I felt toward him evaporated. He wasn't just a bully or a crook, he was arrogant. His power had made him feel so untouchable that he didn't even see the need to hide his crimes from the one person whose entire job was to find them. He was confessing to me, because in his mind, I was powerless to do anything with the information. I was just a girl playing with paper. From that day on, my work changed. I was no longer just a compliance manager. I was an archivist, a secret keeper. I began saving everything, every audit report, every suspicious email, every contract draft. But I went deeper. He thought in terms of paper, of documents that could be shredded or deleted. I thought in terms of data, which is far harder to kill. I saved the files, but more importantly, I saved their metadata. He didn't know what metadata was. He wouldn't have cared. To him, it was invisible, irrelevant. To me, it was everything. It was the digital fingerprint that told the true story. The timestamp showing a file was created at 3 a.m. from his home office, not during business hours. The user log showing that a financial report was accessed and altered by his executive assistant, not by the accounting department. The version history on a PDF contract that showed the payment terms being changed after it was digitally signed. I built a silent, invisible arsenal, a complete, time-stamped history of his corruption, saved on an encrypted external drive, with copies in a cloud server he didn't know existed. It was my insurance policy. I told myself it was for the company's protection, for my own protection. But somewhere, in a cold, quiet part of my heart, I knew I was building a weapon. I didn't know when I would use it, or how. I just knew that one day, he would push me too far. The night he hit me was that day. The SOC2 memo he was screaming about wasn't just some random report. It was the key. It was the report that officially flagged a critical failure in the security of the digital trust archives, the very system that held the records of his fraudulent transactions. His paranoid rage wasn't just about my grandmother's will. It was the panic of a king who realized someone had found a crack in the castle wall. He never knew that I had automated its release. A simple script I had written if the access log issue wasn't patched by 10:30 p.m. on the final day of the quarter. The memo would be automatically sent to the entire board of directors. He was so consumed by his drunken fury, so focused on punishing me for my perceived betrayal, that he ignored the ticking clock of his own broken system. As he stood over me that night, spitting his threats, he thought he was ending a conversation. He had no idea that his fists, his rage, and his arrogance had just provided the one thing my mountain of data was missing: a time-stamped, undeniable motive. The final memo, my last official act as a compliant employee, was already on its way. A digital flare fired into the night, illuminating the corruption he thought was safely hidden in the shadows. The rules he so openly mocked were no longer just on paper. They were in the air, in the code, and they were coming for him. The next morning, the sun rose with a kind of brutal indifference. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was a stranger's, a woman with one side of her face a swollen, mottled canvas of purple and blue, The pain was a dull, constant throb, a physical reminder of the night's violation. Getting ready for work was a slow, deliberate act of construction. I was building a facade, a mask to wear into the lion's den. I started with a color-correcting primer, the cool green paste a pathetic defense against the violent bloom on my skin. Then came the concealer, thick and opaque, which I applied with the detached precision of an artist restoring a damaged painting. Layer after layer, I patted and blended, erasing the evidence of his fist. By the time I was done, my skin was a flawless, artificial canvas. The woman in the mirror looked pale and tired, but unbroken. The bruise was still there, a hot, aching presence beneath the surface. But it was my secret now. Walking into the Hendricks Group headquarters felt like stepping onto a stage. The air, usually charged with the hum of ambition and commerce, was thick with a new, nervous tension. It was almost imperceptible, a change in barometric pressure that only someone attuned to the building's rhythms would notice. The security guards. "Good morning, Ms." Moore was a little too loud. The receptionist's smile a little too tight. Sharon, Mark's executive assistant for the last 2 decades, was the first real test. Her desk was an oak fortress guarding the entrance to his corner office, and her eyes missed nothing. As I approached, she looked up over her glasses, her gaze immediately snagging on my face. "Rachel, good morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Hendricks is looking for you. He's in a meeting, but he wants to see you the second it's over." She paused, her head tilting slightly. "Is everything all right? Dear, you look pale." There it was, the first probe. I manufactured a smile. Feeling the pull on my bruised cheek, I busied myself by taking my laptop from its bag. The simple action, a shield against her scrutiny. "I'm fine. Sharon, thank you. Just a late night." I powered on the machine, the familiar startup chime an anchor in the swirling current of my anxiety. "It's nothing. Really just a system memo that was sent out by mistake. It is a mess sometimes." I gave her a conspiratorial shrug, casting the issue as a mundane technical failure, a problem for the nerds in the basement. It was a perfectly plausible lie. She nodded slowly, her eyes still searching my face for a crack in the veneer. But I was already focused on my screen, projecting an aura of bored competence. The mask was holding. I didn't go to my own office. I went to the small, glass-walled conference room on the executive floor, the one reserved for junior executives and managers. I wanted to be visible. I wanted to watch. Through the glass, I could see the VPs and department heads moving through the halls, their paths intersecting, breaking apart, and reforming in hushed duos and trios. They spoke in low murmurs, their faces grim. On the screen of a passing analyst, I saw the subject line of the email that was consuming them all. Critical SOC2 control failure authorization access logs. Missing. The words looked stark and beautiful on the screen. They were my words, my protocol, my tripwire. It was a virus I had released into the corporate bloodstream, and now I was watching the fever spread. A cold, vibrating calm settled over me. The fear from the night before had been burned away, leaving something harder and clearer in its place. At 10:15 a.m., Sharon's voice came over my desk phone. "Rachel, Mr. Hendricks needs you in the main boardroom. Now." The boardroom was on the 50th floor, a glass-encased sanctuary of power overlooking Lake Michigan. The view was breathtaking, designed to make anyone sitting at the 20-foot obsidian table feel like a master of the universe. Today, however, the masters looked like frightened children. They were all there, the board members, the chief financial officer, the chief technology officer, and Arthur Vance, the company's general counsel. They were clustered in small groups, their coffee cups untouched, their voices low. I chose a chair against the wall, away from the main table, next to a junior counsel who was there to take notes. I was an observer, not a participant. My role was to be furniture, to be overlooked. I opened my laptop and pretended to review a document. Mark strode in a few minutes later, all bluster and forced confidence, He was wearing a crisp navy suit, his face a mask of command, but I could see the signs of the storm, the slight puffiness around his eyes from the alcohol, the faint tremor in his hand as he poured a glass of water. He was a good actor, but I had been studying him my entire life. I knew his tells. "All right, let's settle down," he boomed, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I'm sure you all received the rather dramatic email last night. First, let me assure you, there is no need for alarm. We had a minor server glitch, an IT hiccup. It triggered a legacy alert protocol. It's a false alarm. Our tech team is already on top of it." He smiled, a wide, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. Now, on to the quarterly logistics reports. A palpable discomfort rippled around the table. He was trying to bulldoze past it, to use his authority to make the problem disappear. But the memo was too specific, too alarming. David Chen, the CTO, a man who normally trembled in Mark's presence, cleared his throat. "Mark, with respect, it doesn't look like a glitch. The report is very specific. It details a multi-week failure to log authorization access to the trust archives. That's a significant security breach. It's a direct violation of our SOC 2 compliance." Mark's eyes narrowed. "As I said, David, it's being handled. It's an IT matter. It became a board matter when the report was sent to every single one of us." Another board member chimed in. "The optics of this are terrible." From my corner, I watched, my face a perfect mask of neutral interest. I glanced at my watch. It was 10:42 a.m., exactly 12 hours since the memo had been sent, exactly 12 hours since he had stood over me on my apartment floor. The bruise on my cheek throbbed with the memory, a secret pulse keeping time with the clock. I replayed the scene in my mind, the sound of his knuckles against my skin, the taste of blood, the sharp, clean chime of the email notification, violence and data, inextricably linked at 10:42 p.m. No one in this room knew they were sitting in the second act of a play that had started with a closed-fist punch. They were debating a data breach. I was attending the inquest of my own assault. Mark's denials grew more aggressive, his explanations more convoluted. He blamed a new software patch, a faulty server rack, an incompetent junior programmer. With every excuse, the web of his lies grew more tangled. He was so used to his words being accepted as truth that he didn't realize he was digging his own grave. The more he tried to conceal, the more he revealed his own desperation. His attempts to project control were only highlighting his loss of it. Then, Arthur Vance, the general counsel, spoke. Arthur was a calm, precise man in his late 60s, a creature of pure logic and liability. He wasn't afraid of Mark, he was afraid of lawsuits. "Mark," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "Let's set aside the cause for a moment. I've reviewed the report's raw data." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. This was not a randomly generated alert. The metadata indicates it was created and triggered by a compliance protocol that appears to have been in place for some time. It is not a legacy alert. It is active. The room went completely silent. Mark's face was a thundercloud. Arthur continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "So, the pertinent question is not what caused the glitch. The question is, who wrote the protocol that generated this report?" Every head turned. Eyes scanned the faces around the table, searching for the author, the architect of this chaos. They looked at the CTO, who shook his head. They looked at the junior counsel, who looked terrified. Their gazes swept past me, my face impassive, my fingers resting lightly on my keyboard. I was invisible. I was just the compliance manager, the girl who made sure they colored inside the lines. No one would ever suspect that I was the one who had drawn this line, a digital tripwire that the CEO himself had just walked right into. I held my breath. I could feel the invisible threads of power in the room shifting, detaching from Mark at the head of the table and coalescing into a question mark that hung in the air. I met Arthur's gaze for a fraction of a second, then looked back down at my screen. My expression unchanged. I remained perfectly still, perfectly silent. And in that silence, I felt a new sensation, something more potent than fear or anger. It was power, Not the loud, brittle power that Mark wielded through intimidation, but a quiet, dense power that came from holding a truth no one else knew. It was the power of evidence, the power of a witness who refused to speak until the perfect moment. For the first time, I understood that authority didn't come from a title on a door. It came from being the only person in the room who knew what would happen next. The internal audit at Hendricks Group became a farce, a carefully orchestrated piece of corporate theater with Mark as the director. It was a witch hunt disguised as due diligence. Teams were assembled, interviews were conducted, and data logs were pored over, all under the pretense of finding the source of the glitch. But I knew its true purpose. It was designed to find a scapegoat, and Mark's furious, unfocused gaze was sweeping the company for a suitable sacrifice. This manufactured chaos was the perfect cover. While he was busy chasing shadows and grilling the IT department, I began my own quiet, targeted investigation into the one thing that truly mattered: my grandmother's will. My mother's frantic warning echoed in my mind. Don't mention the will. It was the key. His violent rage hadn't just been about a compliance memo. That was the catalyst, not the cause. The real fear was rooted in that document. Using the elevated access granted to me for the official audit, I plunged into the company's deepest digital archives, a digital mausoleum of decades-old contracts, deeds, and estate planning documents. As I sifted through the encrypted files, the search became a kind of seance. I found myself thinking of my grandmother, Helen Hendricks. She was not a sentimental woman, but she was fiercely protective. I remembered sitting with her on the porch of her Lake Geneva home, the summer before she passed. She had been watching Mark, then just her son-in-law and company president, laughing with a group of investors, his charisma a blinding light. Never mistake a bright light for a warm one, Rachel, she had told me, her voice as crisp as the autumn air. Some lights just burn. She had always seen the cold, acquisitive core beneath his charm. She trusted him with the company's operations, but never its heart, and certainly not with my mother's future. I found the folder late one night, buried in a server partition labeled HH Estate Legacy. Inside were 2 PDF files. The first was named Will Final Executed PDF, dated 5 years ago, a month before her death. The second was Addendum AA Holdings Transfer F, dated much more recently. My hands felt cold as I opened the first file. The language was clear, drafted by a lawyer who valued precision over poetry. After a few minor bequests, the core of the document leaped off the page. I give, devise, and bequeath my entire remaining shareholding in Hendricks Group, representing 35% of all outstanding common stock, to my beloved daughter, Eleanor Moore, to my mother, not to her husband, not to a joint trust, to her and her alone. It was a shield, just as I'd always thought, a controlling interest that would have made her a queen in this corporate kingdom, an equal partner, not a subordinate. It would have made her untouchable. My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened the second file. The addendum. The formatting was similar, the legal jargon dense, but the intent was brutally different. It was a short, single-page document that referenced the original will and, citing some vague tax law optimization, stated that all assets bequeathed to Eleanor Moore were to be immediately and irrevocably transferred to the full control of the Hendricks Holdings LLC. Hendricks Holdings LLC, a company I knew well. It was a private holding company Mark had set up years ago. Its sole director and beneficiary was Mark Hendricks. He hadn't just taken control of her shares. He had legally stolen them from her, using a piece of paper to perform the heist. My mother, who trusted him with everything, would have signed anything he put in front of her without reading it. The perfect crime. But in the digital world, there is no perfect crime. There is only sloppy evidence. I ran a metadata extraction program on both files. The original will's data was clean, its digital history consistent with its age. Then, I extracted the metadata from the forged addendum. My breath caught in my throat. File created October 5th, 2025. 9:16 p.m. Author R. Moore. Last modified. By R. Moore, the date was the night he had assaulted me. The time was just over an hour before he had arrived, drunk and raging, at my door, and the author, my name, my God. The pieces crashed together in my mind with the force of a physical blow. He had committed the fraud, then learned about my compliance memo, and in a paranoid, whiskey-fueled panic, he assumed I already knew. He had come to my apartment not just to intimidate me, but to silence the person he believed was about to expose him. The ultimate violation wasn't the punch. It was this. He had used my own identity as a weapon against me. Digging into the server's system logs for that night confirmed it. The addendum was created and uploaded to the secure server from a remote IP address I didn't recognize, using my administrator-level credentials. He had an IT crony, or perhaps he'd stolen my password himself. It didn't matter. He hadn't just forged a will. He had forged my complicity, planting a digital bomb in my name and then attacking me for holding the detonator. A white-hot rage, so pure and cold it felt like ice in my veins, washed over me. This was no longer just about a bruise. It was about my name, my career, my entire life, which he had been willing to burn to the ground to cover his greed. My movements became swift and precise. I created a new, heavily encrypted folder on a secure cloud service unaffiliated with the company. Into it, I placed everything: the original PDF of the will, the forged addendum, the two competing metadata reports laid out side by side, and the system logs from that night, highlighting the use of my credentials from the unauthorized IP address. I triple-checked the encryption key and then composed a new email. The recipient was Julian Croft, my grandmother's old estate lawyer, a semi-retired man who lived and breathed contract law and who had revered Helen Hendricks. The subject line was simple. For Helen, in the body, I wrote only one sentence. I believe you need to see this. I attached the access key to the cloud folder and hit send. The evidence was now off-site, out of Mark's reach, and in the hands of a man loyal to my grandmother's memory. 2 days later, my mother appeared at my apartment. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, her face a pale mask of anxiety. She was holding a slim leather clutch with both hands, as if it were a life raft. Mark is going insane. Rachel, she said, her voice barely a whisper. This audit, he's tearing the company apart. He told me they are investigating your department, that you might be in trouble. I looked at her, at this woman who had chosen willful blindness as a survival strategy for decades. I'm not in any trouble, Mom. Tears welled in her eyes. Then stop it. Whatever you're doing, please, just stop it. You've made your point. He's scared. Just let it go. If you push him any further, he'll lose everything. We'll lose everything. Her plea, the raw desperation in her voice, should have moved me. Instead, it felt like an anchor, trying to drag me back down into the suffocating silence I had lived in my whole life. I walked over to my desk and picked up a small, silver picture frame. It was a photo of her and me, years ago, on a beach. We were smiling, happy, before him. He will lose what he stole, I said, my voice quiet but unyielding, and we will lose the cage he built around us with it. It's our life, she cried, the tears now streaming down her face. I turned to face her, my gaze steady. The man who hit his daughter over a memo would do far worse to his wife for 35% of his company. Don't you think? The question hung in the air between us, brutal and undeniable. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not just fear of him, but a deeper, older fear, the knowledge that I was right. She shook her head, a gesture of pure denial, and stumbled out of my apartment without another word. The chasm between us was now complete. She had made her choice. She would stay with the monster she knew. The next afternoon, I met Julian Croft at a small coffee shop tucked away on a side street near the courthouse. He was in his 70s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. He had a tablet resting on the table in front of him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. I spoke with the notary on the original will. I spoke with your grandmother's financial advisor. The document I accessed is ironclad and reflects her final wishes exactly as I remember them, he said, his voice a low rumble of controlled indignation. The addendum is a clumsy, transparent forgery. The metadata you provided is, well, it's a prosecutor's dream. He looked up from the tablet, his eyes locking onto mine. He used your credentials. He was setting you up to take the fall if this ever came to light. I simply nodded. Sipping my black coffee, he leaned forward slightly. This is bigger than just probate fraud, Rachel. This is a matter for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Forgery, corporate malfeasance, conspiracy. The compliance memo you wrote, the one they are all running around trying to discredit, it's the key. It establishes a pattern of behavior. He pointed a finger at the tablet. The forged will provides the motive for him needing to control the digital archives. The server logs prove he had the means and opportunity to cover his tracks. The missing access logs flagged in your memo are the proof of that cover-up. He paused, letting the pieces connect. All the SEC needs is a credible whistleblower to tie it all together, to give them a reason to look. He looked at me, his expression grimly serious. An official report from you, as compliance manager, stating you have reason to believe the security breach flagged in your memo at 10:42 p.m. was a deliberate act to conceal ongoing financial malfeasance. That will be more than enough. That will start the war. The declaration of war was a single, encrypted email sent from a public library computer 2 blocks from Julian Croft's office. The moment I hit send, a clock started ticking, and the carefully controlled chaos of Mark's internal witch hunt was rendered obsolete. My whistleblower report to the SEC, submitted through Julian, triggered an immediate and overwhelming response. The corporate theater was over. The real auditors were coming. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, a team of 4 from a Big 3 accounting firm, their faces impassive, their suits a uniform of gray and black. They didn't request a meeting with Mark. They served a notice to the legal department. They weren't there to consult. They were there to seize. Their first demand was simple, absolute, and non-negotiable. They wanted a forensically sound, bit-for-bit image of the company's primary financial and archival servers, including all access logs, dating back 5 years. The panic that washed over the executive floor was a visible, palpable thing. Mark's carefully constructed kingdom, which ran on his authority and unwritten rules, was suddenly invaded by an outside force that cared only for data, rules, and regulations. They were immune to his charm, unimpressed by his power, and deaf to his threats. I watched the fallout from my office, a quiet observer at the heart of the storm I had created. Mark locked himself in his office for hours. The muffled sounds of his enraged yelling could be heard even through the thick oak door. He was a king whose castle walls had been breached, and he was raging at the inevitable. That night, he made his move. He didn't use company resources. He was smarter than that. At 11 p.m., a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the private executive garage. 2 men in unmarked polo shirts, carrying heavy-duty Pelican cases, were escorted to the server room by Mark's loyal head of security. They were from a boutique cybersecurity firm in Virginia, the kind of place corporations hire when they need digital problems to disappear quietly. They were cleaners. Their job was to sanitize the servers, to scrub the digital history, to bleach the evidence from existence before the auditors could get their hands on it in the morning. They were erasing his crimes with surgical precision, wiping the very logs the SEC had demanded. He was destroying the crime scene. It was a desperate, illegal, and profoundly stupid act, and I had counted on it. Because 2 weeks earlier, late on a Sunday night when the entire building was empty, I had performed my own clandestine operation, using a ghost administrator account I had created months before Sysintegrator, a name so boringly corporate no one would ever question it. I had done exactly what the auditors were now demanding. I had created a perfect, forensically sound image of the entire target drive. It wasn't a copy. It was a digital photograph of the crime scene in its pristine, unaltered state, capturing every file, every log, every deleted fragment, and every piece of metadata, the complete, unvarnished truth. stored on a solid-state drive no bigger than a credit card. The next morning, while Mark's cleaners were finishing their work, I met Julian Croft in the lobby of his building. I handed him a small, plain manila envelope. Inside was the drive. "This is everything," I said, a perfect mirror of the servers before they were wiped last night. Julian, ever the professional, simply nodded, his face grim. "The SEC has already filed a subpoena for these materials, citing your report. Their forensic team is waiting." He handed me a document. It was a formal declaration. My official statement as a whistleblower. It was concise, legally vetted, and devastating. At the bottom, there was a single line for me to sign, attesting to the truth of the contents. And at the heart of the document was one anchor-like sentence Julian had insisted upon, the phrase that would tie all the disparate pieces of the investigation together. The timeline of the incident under review, including the primary security breach and suspected malfeasance, began at 10:42 p.m. on October 5th. I signed it. The war was now public. The news broke an hour later. It wasn't a leak. It was a formal press release from the SEC. The headlines exploded across every financial news network. Hendricks Group halted pending SEC investigation into serious allegations of fraud. CEO Mark Hendricks at center of forgery. Data tampering probe whistleblower report. Triggers full-scale investigation. I watched from my desk as the company's stock ticker on the news channel turned into a cascading red waterfall. The price plummeted by 30% in the first 10 minutes of trading. By noon, it was down by more than half. Decades of value, of reputation, of power were being incinerated in real time. My little memo had become a global headline. Mark's reaction was predictable. He didn't call me. He called my mother. He summoned her to his office. His last-ditch attempt to use the only weapon he had left family. I learned later from my mother's driver, a kind man who had known me since I was a teenager, what had happened. Mark had apparently thrown a crystal glass against the wall when she entered, then launched into a tirade, a desperate, gasping performance of betrayal and victimhood. "He's going to prison. Eleanor," he had screamed. "Because of her. Your daughter. She's going to destroy this family. Destroy everything we've built. You have to stop her. You have to tell the world she's a liar." He was trying to force her to choose, to stand by his side and denounce me. He was pleading, threatening, and cajoling all at once. And my mother, the woman who had spent a lifetime appeasing him, who had chosen silence and complicity at every turn, did the one thing he never expected. She said nothing. She just stood there, in the opulent office that was the source of all her comfort and all her misery, and stared at him while his world burned down. She listened to his threats and his pleas, and she did not say a word. Her silence was not passive. It was a verdict. In the defining moment of her life, she had finally, irrevocably, chosen a side. She had chosen me, the board, which was now in a state of shareholder-induced terror, moved swiftly. An emergency meeting was called. I was no longer an invisible employee to be seated against the wall. I was summoned by the audit committee. The company's star witness, Julian Croft, was there with me, a silent, formidable presence at my side. Mark was already there when we walked in, looking haggard and defeated. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed fury. The sycophants who had once laughed at his jokes now refused to meet his gaze. Arthur Vance, the general counsel, read from a prepared statement. "Mark, in light of the ongoing SEC investigation and the serious allegations of evidence tampering, the board has voted unanimously. We are asking you to take an indefinite and immediate leave of absence as chairman and CEO. It was a coup, executed with the bloodless efficiency of corporate law." He was being exiled from his own kingdom. His eyes scanned the faces of the men who had betrayed him, but they landed, finally, on me. I was sitting across the table, my expression calm, my hands folded. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the tense silence. He looked directly at me, his voice a low, ragged snarl, laced with a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim the moral high ground. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, his voice breaking. To destroy your own father. The room held its breath. All eyes were on me. They were expecting tears, a family drama, an emotional outburst. I gave them none of it. I looked at this man who was my father in name only, the man who had hit me, stolen from my mother, and used my name to cover his crimes, and I felt nothing but a profound, empty coldness. I leaned forward slightly, my voice clear and steady, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. You destroyed him a long time ago. Mark, I said, all I did was turn on the light so the world could see it. The conference room felt like a vacuum, a space stripped of air and sound. We were no longer in the Hendricks Group headquarters, but in a neutral, sterile environment rented by the SEC, all blonde wood and gray upholstery. The men and women from the commission sat on one side of a long, polished table, their faces betraying nothing. On the other side sat Mark, flanked by a team of expensive, aggressive lawyers. My mother was there, seated in a chair against the wall behind Mark, her presence required as a key party to the estate. Julian Croft sat beside me, a silent, granite-like figure. The lead investigator, a woman named Agent Hernandez, had been methodically building a case for hours. She had presented the server images the original I had saved, and the scrubbed version Mark's team had created. The contrast was damning. A forensic analyst had walked them through the metadata on the forged addendum, proving it was created from an external IP, using my credentials on the night of October 5th. They had a mountain of digital evidence, a perfect, logical timeline of fraud, and a subsequent cover-up, but data has no voice. It cannot convey intent or malice. Hernandez paused, her dark eyes fixing on me. Ms. Moore, she began, her voice calm and even. The evidence shows a clear attempt by Mr. Hendricks to conceal financial crimes by altering and then destroying company data. The timing of these actions is conspicuous. She looked over at Mark, whose jaw was set in a rigid line. What the data does not show is motive for the data destruction beyond simple concealment. It does not prove direct intimidation. We need to establish a clear link between the security breach you flagged and any personal pressure you may have been under. Did Mr. Hendricks ever threaten you? Did he attempt to coerce you into silence? This was the moment. The entire room was still. Mark's lead lawyer started to rise, preparing to object, but Hernandez held up a hand, her gaze never leaving mine. Let her answer the question. Counsel. I didn't speak. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. I reached into my briefcase and took out my personal cell phone, placing it gently on the table. The small, black rectangle seemed insignificant in the vast, polished space. It was a personal object in a world of legal documents and corporate procedure. Mark watched me, a flicker of confusion, then dawning horror in his eyes. He knew. With steady hands, I unlocked the screen. I navigated to the voice memo app, my fingers moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. I selected a file named only with a date, 10/05/2025. I pressed play and turned the phone's speaker up. The first sound to fill the silent room was my own breathing, ragged and uneven. Then, another sound emerged from the speaker, sharp and relentless, the loud methodical ticking of a grandfather clock. It was a sound from another time, an analog heartbeat in a digital world. Then came his voice, even distorted by the phone's small microphone. It was unmistakably Mark Hendricks. It was not the voice of the confident CEO, but the slurred, venomous roar of a drunken bully. You think you can hide from me? In my building, I own this place. You little brat. A collective intake of breath went around the room. Mark's lawyers sat frozen, their faces turning to stone. My mother closed her eyes. The recording continued. It captured the sound of my stumbling, a muffled cry of pain as my head hit the table, and then his voice again, colder now, dripping with contempt. Let that be a lesson. You're just like your mother. You think you're strong, but you break so easily. Don't even think about telling anyone. A hysterical daughter making wild accusations against her loving stepfather. No one will ever believe you. The threat hung in the air, naked and brutal. I could feel the temperature in the room drop. The investigators' impassive faces had hardened into masks of cold anger. The recording went on for another 30 seconds, capturing nothing but the ticking clock and my quiet, pained sobs. And then, at the very end, came one final, crucial sound. It was sharp, clean, and digital. The distinct ping of an incoming email notification. I pressed stop. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute. It was heavier and more damning than anything that had been said. In that silence, every person in the room understood. They had not just heard a threat. They had heard the precise moment a crime was time-stamped. They had heard the convergence of physical violence and digital evidence. Agent Hernandez was the first to speak. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, though it carried across the still room like a shout. "Ms. Moore," she said. Her eyes locked on my phone. The email notification chime on that recording. Was its arrival time 10:42 p.m.? I didn't need to answer with words. I simply looked at her and gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. That was when Mark broke. The facade of the powerful, wronged CEO shattered into a million pieces. He lunged forward in his chair, his face contorted in a mask of purple rage, spittle flying from his lips. "It's a lie. A setup." "She framed me," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "That recording is fake. She edited it. She's a vindictive, manipulative liar who has been planning this for years. He was a wild animal caught in a trap, thrashing and biting at the steel that held him. His lawyers tried to restrain him, murmuring uselessly in his ear. And then, a quiet voice cut through his frantic denials. It came from Arthur Vance, the general counsel, who had been silent throughout the proceedings. His face a grim study in self-preservation. He wasn't looking at Mark. He was looking at Agent Hernandez. "For the record," Arthur said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He just confirmed it's his voice. The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Mark froze, his mouth open, the realization of his catastrophic mistake dawning in his eyes. In his haste to deny the context, he had validated the content. He hadn't said, "That's not me," he had said. "She framed me," he had confessed. I turned my head and looked at my mother. She was still sitting against the wall, her hands clenched in her lap. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek, but she made no sound. Her face was a landscape of grief, but also of resolve. Her tears were not for him. They were an elegy for the life she had lost, for the lies she had lived. But her silence was her final, damning testimony. The meeting ended abruptly after that. It was no longer a deposition. It was the prelude to an indictment. Mark was escorted out by his lawyers, a broken, defeated man stripped of his power and his dignity. As Julian and I walked out into the sterile hallway, we were met by a barrage of flashing cameras and shouted questions from the reporters who had been camped out all day. "Ms. Moore, is it true the CEO has been suspended? What was in the whistleblower report? Is there a connection to the security memo sent out at 10:42 p.m. last week?" That last question, shouted by a young, eager reporter, was the one that stuck. The phrase was repeated by another, then another. It spread through the media scrum like wildfire. The 1042 memo, the 1042 incident, the perfect, headline-ready name for a scandal had been born. I didn't answer any of their questions. I kept my eyes fixed forward, my face a neutral mask, and let Julian guide me through the chaos to a waiting car. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the building. The battle was won. The king had been deposed, but I felt no triumph, only a grim, cold resolve. I had exposed the truth. I had taken back my name, but I had not yet reclaimed what was stolen. I turned away from the window, my gaze fixed on the road ahead. There was still work to be done. The days that followed the SEC deposition were unnervingly quiet. The storm of the 1042 WAG incident raged on every news channel and financial blog, a hurricane of speculation and outrage with my name at its eye. But inside my apartment, a heavy, profound silence had fallen. The city's roar was a distant hum, the constant ringing of my phone a muted vibration on the kitchen counter. I had muted the world, retreating into a quiet, sterile space where I could simply breathe. I felt hollowed out, as if the confrontation had scoured me clean of every emotion, leaving only a cold, clear sense of purpose. The doorbell rang late one evening, a sharp, intrusive sound that made me flinch. I wasn't expecting anyone. Julian communicated through encrypted emails, and the press had long since given up on my apartment. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was my mother. She stood alone in the hallway, a solitary figure under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was without her usual armor, no perfectly coiffed hair, no statement jewelry, no designer handbag. She wore a simple gray coat and had a scarf wrapped around her neck, and she looked smaller, older, and more fragile than I had ever seen her. She was not Mrs. Mark Hendricks, the CEO's wife. She was just Eleanor Moore, a woman standing at her daughter's door. I took a breath and opened it. We stood for a moment in the doorway, two strangers who knew each other's secrets. The space between us was thick with years of unspoken words, a chasm of things done and not done. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. I stepped aside and let her pass. She walked into my living room, her eyes taking in the sparse, orderly space. It was so different from her own home, a place of plush carpets and heavy draperies, a museum of a life lived for appearances. Here, there was nowhere to hide. She didn't sit down. She turned to face me, her hands clutching a long, cream-colored envelope as if it were a shield. The paper was old, its edges softened with time. She held it out to me. Her hand was trembling. "This is the real one," she said, her gaze fixed on the floor. "The original. From Grandma Helen's lawyer. I've had it all these years." I took the envelope from her. The paper felt warm, almost alive. I didn't need to open it. I knew what it was. It was the truth, in physical form. Why, I asked, my voice flat. It was the only word I could manage. "I was afraid," she whispered, finally looking up at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. The cold clarity inside me sharpened to a fine point. I had to know. I had to hear her say it. "What were you more afraid of?" "Mom." "The truth, or him?" Her face crumpled, the carefully constructed mask of composure dissolving into pure, unvarnished anguish. A sob caught in her throat. "Both," she choked out. "I was afraid of both." And in that one word, I understood everything. I saw her life not as a series of choices, but as a series of surrenders. She was afraid of the truth of my grandmother's will, because it would have forced a confrontation she didn't have the strength for. It would have meant standing up to Mark, asserting her own power, and risking the gilded cage he had built around her. So she had chosen the cage. She had chosen to be afraid of him, because that fear was simpler, more familiar, than the terrifying prospect of being free. She had traded her power for peace, and in doing so, had left us both defenseless. I saw her then not as a traitor, but as a casualty, a victim of her own fear, a prisoner long before Mark ever laid a hand on me. I stepped forward and put my arms around her. She flinched at first, surprised, then collapsed against me, her body shaking with silent sobs. I held her, my cheek resting against her hair. It was the first time we had embraced in years, and it felt less like a reunion and more like a farewell. We were two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage, acknowledging a bond that had been irrevocably broken. After a long moment, she pulled away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at the envelope in my hand, her expression shifting from sorrow to a kind of desperate pleading. "He is a ruined man." "Rachel," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its old strength. "The company is gone. His reputation is gone. He will likely go to prison. You have won." She took a shaky breath. "If you publish this, if you bring this will to the court, it will be the final blow. It will be a public declaration that our entire life was a lie. He will lose everything that is left, but you have to understand." She met my eyes, her own pleading with me. "You'll lose me, too. I cannot be a part of this final, desecration. This is our family you are destroying. Her words were meant to be a threat, an ultimatum. Choose me, or choose your justice. But they landed in a place inside me that was already empty. The daughter who would have been swayed by that threat, the girl who craved her mother's approval above all else, no longer lived here. I looked at her, and the cold clarity returned, but this time it was laced with a profound and bottomless sadness. I already lost you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I lost you at 10:42. The color drained from her face. She understood immediately. 10:42 was not just the time on a memo. It was the moment the world had split, the moment the violence was real. The threat was manifest, and she was not there. In that moment, when I was on the floor of my apartment, bleeding and alone, the comforting illusion of mother had vanished. I had been truly, utterly on my own, and in that solitude, I had found a strength she had never known. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were different. They were tears of acceptance, of understanding. She knew I was right. The chasm between us was too wide to cross. She reached out and laid a trembling hand on my cheek, her touch as light as a ghost's. It was a gesture of goodbye. Then, she turned and walked to the door. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't look back. I listened to her footsteps fade down the hall until there was only silence again. I was alone. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. My mother's final offering. My grandmother's last wish. I carefully broke the wax seal and slid out the thick, cream-colored pages. The legal language was dense, but at the very end, there was my grandmother's signature. Helen H. Hendricks. It was shaky, the penmanship of a woman whose body was failing her, but the intent behind it was as firm and unyielding as the steel her family used to build empires. It was a signature of love and protection, a final, desperate attempt to shield her daughter from the man she knew would consume her. He had not only stolen my mother's inheritance, he had stolen her strength. He had stolen her voice. This document was the ghost of that voice. I walked to my desk, sat down, and scanned each page with meticulous care. Then, I composed a new email to Julian Croft. The subject was simple: probate filing. Estate of Helen H. Hendricks. I attached the scanned file. In the body of the email, I wrote a single instruction: Julian, please file this with the court at your earliest convenience. As I hovered my finger over the send button, I felt no anger. The white-hot rage had cooled into something clean and hard, like forged steel. This was not for him. This was not revenge. Vengeance was a messy, emotional thing. This was an act of restoration, an act of accounting. It was for my grandmother, whose last wish had been ignored. It was for my mother, who had lost her voice so long ago. And it was for me, the woman who had finally found hers. This was for justice. I clicked send. The probate filing was a spark thrown into a room full of gasoline. I had expected a slow, methodical legal process, a quiet grinding of the gears of justice. I had underestimated the voracious appetite of the modern news cycle. Julian Croft filed the authentic will with the probate court on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the world was on fire. The article appeared on the homepage of the Wall Street Journal's website. A digital bombshell with a deceptively simple headline: Hendricks Group founders' will surfaces. Alleges CEO forged inheritance to seize control. It was written by a veteran investigative journalist who had clearly been following the SEC probe. She connected the dots with brutal, journalistic precision. The story laid out the timeline: the sudden SEC investigation, the rumors of a whistleblower, and now, the explosive probate filing that provided the motive for everything. It was a masterpiece of corporate evisceration. But it was the image accompanying the article that turned a corporate scandal into a cultural phenomenon. The journalist had somehow obtained a screenshot of the automated email that had started it all. There it was, in stark black and white, for the entire world to see. Subject: Critical SOC 2, Control Failure, Authorization Access. Logs missing, sent 10/05/2025. 10:42. p.m. That timestamp, my secret, silent witness, was now public domain. It was the digital fingerprint on the murder weapon. The story was a match. Social media was the accelerant. Within an hour, the hashtag began to trend. 42 memo. At first, it was just traders and financial analysts, dissecting the implications for the market, but then it mutated. It was picked up by legal bloggers, by tech journalists fascinated by the metadata trail, and then by the wider world. 1042 memo became a symbol. It was a shorthand for every woman who had ever been dismissed, silenced, or underestimated by a powerful man. It was a story of a quiet, methodical takedown, not with a weapon, but with a timestamp. Memes appeared: the distracted boyfriend looking away from corporate bluster to stare at a well-timed memo. Think pieces were written about the weaponization of corporate compliance and the revenge of the overlooked woman. My anonymous act of self-preservation had become a public rallying cry. I watched it all from the cold blue light of my laptop screen, a detached observer of the inferno I had set. The digital roar was deafening, yet my apartment was silent. The financial markets reacted with primal, reptilian fear. Investors don't care about morality, but they are terrified of instability and fraud. The story of the forged will was not just a crime. It was a foundational lie at the heart of the company's leadership. It meant the man in charge was not just a bully, but a thief. Trust, the invisible currency upon which all markets are built, evaporated in an instant. The stock, already battered, went into a freefall. Panicked sell orders flooded the exchange, a digital tsunami of no confidence. The ticker symbol, HNDX, became a river of blood flowing across the bottom of every news channel. Markets spent a lifetime building an empire of concrete and steel, but its value was just a number on a screen, and that number was dying. Within 48 hours of the article's publication, Hendricks Group had lost 62% of its remaining market capitalization, billions of dollars in value. Gone, wiped out by a single PDF and a 4-digit timestamp. I felt no triumph, only the quiet hum of a complex machine executing its final command. On Friday afternoon, my personal phone rang. It was Julian Croft. "Rachel," he said, his voice calm and professional, but with an undercurrent of grim satisfaction. "I thought you should know. A warrant was issued about an hour ago. Obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of wire fraud. They took him into custody from his home. He is being processed downtown." "Is he eligible for bail?" I asked, my own voice a stranger's, cool and distant. Given the evidence of data destruction and the scale of the fraud, the U.S. attorney is arguing he's a significant flight risk. It's unlikely they'll grant it. He was in a cell. The man who had once owned a skyscraper was now in a cage. The abstract consequences had become brutally concrete. "Thank you for letting me know." "Julian," I said, "you did the right thing." "Rachel, your grandmother would be proud." I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the city he had once ruled. It looked exactly the same. The world hadn't stopped turning. It had just moved on without him. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my mother. 5 simple, devastating words. "He wants to see you." I looked at the message, at the plea hidden within it, a final, desperate attempt to pull me back into the orbit of their shared tragedy. It was a test, a final loyalty oath she was asking me to consider. I set the phone down on the counter, screen facing down. I did not reply. My silence was the only answer I had left to give. The following Monday, I had to go to Julian's office to sign the final affidavits for the probate court. I knew the press would be there. They had been camped outside my apartment building for days, a pack of wolves sensing the final act was near. I chose to walk. I wanted to meet the storm on my own terms, on my own 2 feet. The moment I stepped out of the lobby, the chaos erupted. A wall of bodies and cameras surged forward, a tidal wave of shouted questions and blinding flashes. "Ms. Is it true you were the whistleblower? What's your reaction to the CEO's arrest? How long have you known about the forged will? I kept my eyes fixed forward, my face a carefully blank mask, and moved through the crowd, creating a small wake in the sea of bodies. Julian's building was only a block away. I was almost there when a young reporter, more agile than the rest, managed to push her way directly in front of me, forcing me to stop. She held her microphone up like a weapon. "Ms. Moore," she asked, her voice cutting through the din. "Everyone is talking about the 1042 memo. It's the email that brought everything down. Are you the one who sent it?" The crowd fell silent, straining to hear my answer. This was the question everyone wanted to know. Was I the avenger? Was I the one who had pushed the button? I looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, I let a crack of the real me show through. I allowed a flicker of the cold, hard truth to surface. "No," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying in the sudden quiet. "I just wrote it, for a single, stunning heartbeat." There was absolute silence. The reporter stared at me, her mind processing the distinction. The creation versus the execution, the truth versus its consequences. Then, the world exploded. The cacophony of camera shutters was like a burst of machine gun fire, 100 flashes going off at once, trying to capture the moment. My statement, my perfectly true, minimalist confession, hung in the air. I turned my back on the chaos and walked the remaining 20 feet to the glass doors of Julian's building. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I simply walked away, leaving my words to echo in the headlines and my image to be burned onto the front page of every newspaper in the country. His lawyer had arranged it. Mark had refused to speak to anyone, refused to cooperate, but he had made one request. Delivered through his legal team with all the imperious command he could still muster, he wanted to see me. Julian advised against it. "There's nothing to be gained. Rachel, it's a game. He wants to get inside your head, but I knew I had to go. This wasn't a legal proceeding. It was an epilogue. It was the final, quiet closing of a door I had kicked off its hinges." The Metropolitan Correctional Center is a concrete spike driven into the heart of downtown Chicago. A brutalist testament to consequence just blocks from the glass towers where men like Mark made their fortunes. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and despair. I surrendered my phone, my bag, my watch. I was stripped of my identity, just like him. Every metal door that buzzed open and slammed shut behind me was a punctuation mark, a full stop on a chapter of my life. The visiting room was not a room at all, but a row of small, sterile cubicles. A thick pane of reinforced glass separated the visitor from the inmate, the free from the caged. The only connection was a pair of circular metal grills for speaking and a small stainless steel counter below. The light was a flat, humming neon that cast a pale, bluish tint on everything, draining the world of color and warmth. It was the color of a morgue. I sat down on the hard plastic stool and waited. A door buzzed on his side of the glass, and he walked in. The change was shocking. The Mark Hendricks I knew was a man who filled rooms, his presence a gravitational force created by tailored suits, expensive cologne, and an unshakable belief in his own dominance. The man who sat down opposite me was a shrunken, hollowed-out version, a ghost haunting the memory of his own power. He was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He had lost weight, a gauntness hollowing out his cheeks and sharpening the lines of his face. His hair, once a perfectly coiffed helmet of silver-tinged authority, was unkempt and had turned a brittle, uniform gray. The only thing that remained was in his eyes. They were bloodshot and tired, but behind the exhaustion, the old fire of his arrogance still burned, a pilot light of pure, unadulterated ego that refused to be extinguished. He picked up the black telephone receiver on his side of the glass. I picked up mine. The line crackled with static. For a long moment, we just stared at each other through the thick, smudged glass. The glass was a perfect metaphor for our relationship. We could see each other. We could hear each other, but we could never, ever touch. He was the first to speak, And when he did, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp, the sound of shattered pride. "You think you won, don't you?" The question was a test, a final attempt to frame this as a contest between us, a game of winners and losers. It was the only way his mind could process the world. I looked at him, at the wreckage of a man who had everything and threw it all away. "No," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "I just stopped losing." He flinched, the words finding their mark. He had expected a gloating victor, someone he could rage against. He didn't know how to respond to the quiet finality of my statement. He leaned back, attempting a sneer that looked more like a grimace. "All of this," he said, gesturing vaguely with one hand, a pathetic imitation of his old, sweeping boardroom gestures. "The company, my life, everything. All because of that damned will. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about money, about inheritance. He thought he was the victim of a greedy stepdaughter. He was blind to the true nature of his crime." I said nothing. Instead, I reached into the simple manila folder I had been allowed to bring with me. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, protected in a clear plastic sleeve. I slid it across the stainless steel counter until it rested against the glass that separated us. It was a high-quality color print of the memo draft I had been reviewing that night, my memo, the one with the subject line that had become a hashtag. And in the bottom right corner, a small, ugly smudge of faded, brownish red, the drop of blood from my lip that had fallen as I lay on the floor of my apartment. It was small, almost insignificant, but under the harsh neon light, it seemed to glow. He leaned forward, his eyes squinting to read the text, then widening as they focused on the small, dark stain. The color drained from his already pale face. He understood. This was never about the will. I said, my voice as cold and hard as the glass between us. This was about this. I tapped my finger on my side of the glass, directly over the bloodstain. This was about the lesson you taught me that night. You taught me that documents don't matter. Rules don't matter. Only evidence matters. I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper. So I used it, just like you would have. You taught me how to be ruthless. You taught me how to use proof as a weapon. This whole thing. This is your legacy. This is the one lesson I learned from you that actually stuck. He stared at the paper, his mouth slightly open. The arrogance in his eyes finally flickered and died, replaced by a vast, empty silence. He had been defeated not by the law, not by the SEC, but by his own philosophy, turned back on him with an efficiency he could never have imagined. He had armed his own executioner. He had created the very monster that was now staring back at him through a pane of glass. I stood up to leave. My part was done. The epilogue was written. I placed the receiver back in its cradle. Wait, his voice was a choked whisper, thin and desperate, coming faintly through the metal grill. I paused, my hand on the back of the stool, but I did not turn around. "What did you say to her?" he asked. "To your mother. How did you turn her against me?" It was the question of a narcissist. In his mind, my mother was a possession, a loyal subject who had been swayed by a traitor. He couldn't conceive that she had a will of her own, a mind that could make its own choice. I turned back slowly, my gaze meeting his through the glass one last time. I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. I wanted this final thought to be the one that would haunt him in his cell for years to come. I told her. I said, my voice very clear, that you hit the wrong person. He frowned, not understanding. You saw me as the threat, the one with the MBA, the one who knew the rules. You thought she was weak. You thought she was just furniture. But you were wrong. The whole time. She was the one with the real power. She had the original will. She had the truth locked away, waiting. Her silence, her fear, that was her weapon. I took a step closer to the glass. A final, parting shot. You shouldn't have been afraid of me. Mark, you should have been afraid of her. My mother is much, much scarier than I am. I held his gaze for a long moment, letting the words sink in. I watched the final flicker of understanding, the realization that he had been undone not by the daughter he fought, but by the wife he had ignored, dawn in his eyes. Then I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I walked past the buzzing doors and the disinterested guards, back into the world of color and light, leaving him behind in the pale, silent glow of his own making. The hearing was not held in a courtroom, where justice is a matter of interpretation and adversarial combat. It took place in a Senate hearing chamber, a grand, wood-paneled amphitheater, where the subject is not law, but public record. It was a stage for the dissection of truth, broadcast live to the nation. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, new money, and the metallic tang of television cameras. Every major news network was present, their lenses like a firing squad aimed at the witness table. I sat beside Julian Croft, a small, still point in a hurricane of procedure and scrutiny. Mark was not there. His presence was a matter for the criminal courts. This was about the collapse of a public company, a post-mortem on a fallen empire, and my role was central to the narrative. Agent Hernandez, speaking on behalf of the SEC's investigative team, stood at a lectern. A massive screen hung behind her. For 3 hours, she methodically constructed the timeline, her voice a calm, dispassionate instrument of demolition. She spoke not in accusations, but in facts, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of the Hendricks Group. At 9:16 p.m. on the evening of October 5th, she began, and an image of the forged addendum's metadata appeared on the screen, my name glowing in the author field. A fraudulent document was created using Ms. Moore's credentials, transferring 35% of company stock to a private holding controlled by the CEO. Mark Hendricks. She clicked a button. The screen changed. At 9:38 p.m., a call was placed from Eleanor Moore to her daughter. Rachel Moore. An anonymized call log appeared. Click. At approximately 10:40 p.m., security footage shows Mr. Hendricks arriving, unannounced, at Ms. Moore's private residence, a grainy, black and white still image of Mark, his face a mask of rage, filled the screen. The room was utterly silent, captivated. This was no longer about balance sheets and stock prices. This was a thriller, unfolding in real time. And then, Hernandez said, her voice dropping slightly, at the precise moment of the physical confrontation, a digital event was triggered. She let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic beat. At 10:42 p.m., she continued, and the screenshot of the email subject line flashed onto the screen. The numbers now iconic. A compliance memo, authored by Ms. Moore and automated to release upon failure to resolve a critical security flaw, was sent to the entire board of directors. A memo flagging a vulnerability in the very system that stored the evidence of the fraudulent will. She paused, turning to face the committee members. The events of 10:42 p.m. are not a coincidence. They are a convergence. The moment of a physical assault designed to ensure silence was also the moment a digital alarm, designed to ensure transparency, was triggered. One event provided the motive, the other provided the proof. The press was in a frenzy, fingers flying across keyboards, broadcasting the narrative to the world. They were already calling it the golden hour, the 60 minutes in which a dynasty's foundation had cracked and crumbled. Finally, after hours of testimony from forensic accountants and cybersecurity experts, the chairman of the committee looked down at his notes, his face grim. The committee would like to thank Agent Hernandez for her thorough presentation, he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. The evidence presented is, frankly, staggering. At this time, we would like to call on the individual at the center of this timeline, the author of the report that brought these crimes to light. He looked directly at me. We recognize on the public record, Ms. Rachel Moore, whistleblower and key witness. 100 cameras swiveled in unison, their lenses finding me. The sound of their shutters was a sudden, violent clatter, like a flock of startled birds taking flight. I felt Julian's hand briefly touch my arm, a small gesture of support. Slowly, I pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not look at the committee. I did not look at the press. I looked out into the gallery, the sea of anonymous faces, and found the one that mattered. My mother sat in the third row. She was dressed simply, a ghost of her former self, yet more solid and real than I had ever seen her. Our eyes met across the crowded room. In that single, silent glance, a lifetime of fear, of unspoken truths, of regret and forgiveness passed between us. I was no longer looking for her approval. I was simply acknowledging our shared survival. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a release, an acceptance, a final, quiet blessing. I turned to face the committee, the cameras, the world. I was ready to speak my truth. Later that evening, the city lights outside my apartment window seemed brighter, sharper. The storm had passed. The aftermath was a quiet hum of legal proceedings and media analysis that felt distant, like a story about someone else. The world knew the facts, the dates, the times, but they would never know the truth of the silence in my apartment after he left, the feel of the cold floor against my bruised cheek, the private moment when fear had burned away and resolve had taken its place. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen booted up, a familiar, comforting ritual. My inbox was a wasteland of unread messages from lawyers, reporters, and strangers. But one sat at the very top, its arrival time just a few minutes prior. There was no name in the sender field, only a string of anonymous characters. The subject line contained just 5 words. Subject: you did the right thing. It could have been from anyone, a board member who had finally found their conscience, an IT analyst who had seen the truth in the logs, Julian, sending a final, quiet message of support, or maybe just a stranger, someone who had watched the hearing and understood. It didn't matter. It was a single, anonymous vote of confidence from a world that had, for a brief moment, seen the truth. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could delete it. I could archive it. I could let it be the final word, a quiet, validating end to the story. But the woman who had sat silently in the corner of the boardroom was gone. The woman who had endured her mother's pleas and her stepfather's rage was gone. The victim was gone. I clicked reply. The cursor blinked in the empty message body, a small, rhythmic pulse waiting for a command. I typed a single line, 2 words and a timestamp that had become my signature, my mantra, my brand. Forward. 10:42 p.m. I hit send. The message disappeared into the ether. A command sent to an unknown recipient. It was not a thank you. It was not a confirmation. It was a promise that the truth, once revealed, would continue to move forward. It was a declaration that I was no longer just the author of the memo. I was now its distributor. I closed the laptop. The screen went dark, turning into a black, polished mirror. It reflected my face, illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights behind me. I saw the faint, fading shadow of the bruise on my cheek, a ghost of the woman I used to be. But my eyes were clear. My expression was calm. There was no victim in that reflection. There was no good daughter, dutifully keeping the peace. There was only a woman who now understood a fundamental truth, one that had been forged in a crucible of violence and data. The truth, if you record it at exactly the right moment, is the only weapon you will ever need. It is the beginning of the story, the end of the argument, and the perfect, silent revenge. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're all tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and showing some extra support by hitting that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.